I'll skip that, but I just want to say thanks to Chris and John for the invitation, and I'm really excited about this tour and discussion in this series. I think the 1970s are a really interesting period of transition in architectural design and landscape design and urbanism. And I think these sites are really an interesting look in kind of seeing how those changes and evolutions are happening in design thinking, and also kind of public perception of architectural design and urbanism, and what open spaces can and should do for the public. So I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation, and to kind of bring it back to the theme that John mentioned of postmodernism in public space. I think we're going to see how some of these designs kind of start in a more modernist or late modernist style, and kind of move through into some postmodernism. For example, the Embarcadero Center has very kind of modernist office towers, but the public space and retail space are very much more in this kind of exploratory postmodern spatial conception, and have kind of more of an interior urbanism that I think is really interesting. And I also just wanted to give a quick plug for Sasaki Walker and Associates, who were the early landscape architecture design consultants on Embarcadero Center. And although I was talking to John about them a lot while we were out filming, somehow I neglected to mention them on camera. So I just wanted to say that now before we dive into the video.
Great, and I'll mention, thank you, Hannah, and I'll also mention that we will be streaming this to Zoom directly. So if you have any bandwidth issues, I will be pasting the YouTube link into the chat box, and you could follow along through YouTube if you need to. But we do recommend, if it's working fine for you, to just watch it through Zoom, because that'll be a true live screening. So I'm going to start my camera here. Hannah can close her camera off if she'd like. And I'm going to mute myself. If you have any questions, again, you can use the Q&A box and let us know if you have any issues in the chat box. So I'm going to mute myself now, and we'll start the screening.
Hi, I'm Hannah Simonson. I'm an architectural historian and cultural resources planner at Page & Turnbull here in San Francisco. I'm also the current president of the Northern California chapter of Docomomo US, which is a nonprofit organization that advocates for the preservation of modern architecture. It's an international organization. And through that group and some other work that I've done here in San Francisco, I gave a tour for the Cultural Landscape Foundation a few years ago of the Embarcadero Plaza and Embarcadero Center. And we're going to be visiting those sites along with a couple of other sites of public space in San Francisco today. And I'm excited to share these really cool spaces with you. So we're here at Embarcadero Plaza in San Francisco. This plaza used to be known as Justin Herman Plaza. We're right on the waterfront, and as you can see, we're right near the ferry building, which is an iconic San Francisco landmark, probably one of the spots that every tourist and visitor and resident has seen before. We're right at the end of Market Street, which is kind of the main commercial thoroughfare through San Francisco. So this is really at the heart of San Francisco's kind of commercial core here. And this plaza was designed by landscape architect Lawrence Halperin, completed in 1972. This was part of a much larger project, the Market Street Redevelopment Plan, which spanned several miles of Market Street, included the redesign of the street itself after the BART public transit system was installed, and included several other plazas like UN Plaza and Halliday Plaza. Halperin worked with a couple of other architects on that project, including John Bowles and John Warnicki and Mario Ciampi. So that was a massive undertaking, and that project kind of terminates in this plaza here next to the water. You can see this is a very open space, very modernist in design, kind of a modernist take on an Italian piazza. The main focal feature, of course, is the fountain, Valancourt Fountain, designed by a sculptor, Armand Valancourt. And this fountain is kind of an interesting remnant of an earlier history in San Francisco. There used to be a double-decker freeway behind us along the Embarcadero. Some people may remember that. But the idea behind the fountain was to kind of bring a more humane scale to the plaza, but also to kind of riff off the concrete monster of the freeway behind it. So there was this sense of water coming out of the fountain and also cars whizzing by. So that created kind of a dramatic effect. It's a bit of a contentious sculpture. You either love it or you hate it. I love it. Halperin loved it as well. He was quoted as saying something to the effect of, if this fountain wasn't one of the great works of civic art, he would slit his throat. A little bit dramatic, but clearly he stood by this design. And I have another quote from, I think it was a newspaper article from the time of construction that described the fountain as, wheezing vehicles on the freeway seem to weave through the concrete sculpture, giving it a kinetic urban essence, and at the same time, embracing and adding dimension to the freeway. So I think that's kind of a poetic way of summing up the kind of design intention of this fountain. So I'm glad it's still here, and I'm glad the water is pouring out today. The plaza itself, I mentioned it's a very open space. It is a public park, so maintained by Rec and Park here, and it's used for all kinds of different events, concerts, public gatherings. Historically, it was a very iconic skateboarding site. You may have seen it in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Nowadays, the skateboarders tend to be further out on the Embarcadero. But this was a very intentional kind of move on Halperin's part. He said of the design that the plaza was conceived as a total environment in which all elements working together create a place for participation. So he's really interested in this being a true public space, a place where people can come together, and the sort of open, unprogrammed nature of it facilitates many, many different kinds of uses over time. So now we're looking down on Embarcadero Plaza, which was designed by landscape architect Lawrence Halperin. If people haven't heard Lawrence Halperin's name, if you've lived in San Francisco, you most certainly have interacted with landscapes designed by Lawrence Halperin. He's really one of the preeminent figures in modern landscape design. He was born in New York City and attended Cornell University and the University of Wisconsin, as well as Harvard's Graduate School of Design. He then apprenticed with landscape architect Thomas Church here in San Francisco. Thomas Church also was kind of one of the founding fathers of modernist landscape design, also based in San Francisco. And after working with Church, while working with Church, one of the kind of most important examples of the new California modern landscape design was the Janelle Garden up in Sonoma County, a beautiful private landscape with a kind of kidney bean shaped pool overlooking the coast. And then in the 40s, he went on to found his own practice here in San Francisco. And it was a really interesting time for landscape architecture in the Bay Area and throughout the country. There's a lot of new construction and redevelopment happening in San Francisco. So Lawrence Halperin is responsible for a number of really important and wonderful projects around San Francisco that you may have visited yourself, including Ghirardelli Square, as well as several other plazas along Market Street, including UN Plaza by the Civic Center and Halliday Plaza, also on Market Street. Other really prominent examples of Halperin's work in San Francisco include Levi's Plaza, which was completed in the 80s, so a little bit later. And outside the Bay Area, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt memorial is probably one of his most prominent works. So there's a lot of fun trivia related to Embarcadero Plaza. Probably my favorite tidbit of trivia is the action movie Bullet has a wonderful scene where the main character is visiting his kind of girlfriend or love interest, and she is a landscape architect, and she actually is filmed in Lawrence Halperin's office, which the building they shared with Worcester, Bernardi, and Emmons. And so you can see examples of Halperin's work on the walls, and she's there actually calculating diameters for some pipes for a fountain. And it's pretty clear based on the timeline and what else is going in the office that she is calculating diameter for the fountain right here in Embarcadero Plaza, which I think is really cool. Embarcadero Plaza has also been the site of many interesting and important events, including Occupy Wall Street. And an even earlier example, U2 had a free concert in the 80s as part of their Joshua Tree tour. And during that concert, Bono spray painted live in front of everyone, "Rock and roll stops the traffic" on the side of the fountain here, much to Dianne Feinstein's chagrin. She apparently was part of an anti-graffiti task force at the time and took him to task for that. And I think he had to publicly apologize for the graffiti. So we've now moved to the Embarcadero Center, which is a very large office and hotel and retail complex in San Francisco. Right now we're standing in what is called a privately owned public open space, or POPOs as we call them in San Francisco. The complex was designed by architect John Portman, and it was built over basically a decade. Construction started in 1971 and finished in 1981, with the whole complex being kind of opened with an opening celebration in 1982. So we're standing at Embarcadero Center 4, which was the last building to be completed. And we're standing just in front of the Tulip, which is a piece of sculpture and public art that John Portman actually designed himself for this space. John Portman was born in 1924 and died in 2017. He was a really prolific Atlanta-based architect and developer. He also had quite an interest in art and sculpture, and so he did a number of artistic pieces on his own as well. He really is known for his hotel designs. These very expansive atrium lobbies were kind of a feature of his hotel design, and he really kind of made that a staple. He worked on this project with a series of other developers, including David Rockefeller and Trammell Crow. David Rockefeller, of course, of the Rockefeller family in New York City, and Trammell Crow of Texas. And this project, when it was first revealed in the late 60s, proposed to the city of San Francisco, there were a lot of people who kind of started calling it Rockefeller Center West, referencing Rockefeller Center in New York City. But the design team really had a massive PR campaign to get people to just call it Embarcadero Center, because they didn't really want the association with Manhattan or New York City, because at the time in San Francisco, there was a lot of concern about how quickly downtown was being developed and all these new high rises that were going in. And San Franciscans were concerned that San Francisco might lose some of its character, become too much like Manhattan. So there was this sort of anti-Manhattanization sentiment that was building during the late 60s and into the early 70s. And part of the argument that Portman made for how this complex gives back to the city and the citizens here is the extensive privately owned public open space. So essentially, this office center has 4 blocks of open plazas at the top, as well as a network of stairs and bridges and different levels of retail below. So it's a really kind of intricate network of open space and retail environment that anyone can partake in. John Portman was definitely interested in how people move through three-dimensional space and kind of making that an event. If you've been to any of John Portman's hotels, you'll know that almost always in the atrium lobby, there are glass elevators that run up along the side of the atrium. So you're kind of looking down into the lobby. It's very dramatic. Here in the Embarcadero Center, there are lots of escalators that move you through these different levels of retail space. And I think this experience also is just really wonderful, like bringing you up through the different levels of the retail, up here to the top of the plaza, up into the air. All right, so we're standing on one of several pedestrian bridges that are part of the Embarcadero Center. And these bridges span over public streets. So we're standing over a street right now. This creates a really kind of cohesive environment here. The idea is that pedestrians don't have to walk at the street level and, you know, wait for traffic lights. You can walk from beginning to end of the Embarcadero Center in just a few minutes using the bridges and stairs. So now we're in the middle of the Embarcadero Center between Embarcadero 1 and 2, and we're looking back again at the ferry building. There was a lot of concern from the community about the height of these towers and whether or not having 4 of them in a row would create kind of a visual barrier between the northern kind of more residential area of Telegraph Hill and Beach and the downtown financial district. However, Portman was very intentional in his design with how the buildings are arranged on the block. So he was really prioritizing the views to the waterfront and the ferry building when kind of siting these buildings. All right, so we're standing on a pedestrian bridge that connects the Embarcadero Center to Maritime Plaza. This was a project that was part of the Golden Gateway redevelopment area, as was the Embarcadero Center. This is an earlier designed building. The tower itself was designed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and Worcester, Bernardi and Emmons designed the base. And an interesting note is that the base of Maritime Plaza, there's a park on the top, and then the base is a kind of concrete facade around a parking garage. So it's very stark kind of pedestrian experience at the street level around that building. And Portman pretty explicitly stated that he wanted the Embarcadero Center to be more porous and more welcoming at the street level, which is kind of learning from, I think, some of the earlier examples of commercial buildings in the area. And it's also kind of interesting to note that Portman had to kind of respond to and work within kind of this overall Golden Gateway redevelopment master planned area. And there's certain buildings and parks that already existed. One of the conditions of approval for the Embarcadero Center was that the developer team would spend 1% of the total construction costs on public art. And this was a kind of interesting decision that was made because in the 1985 downtown plan, this actually became kind of a matter of course. So it was a program that was implemented for downtown construction. But at the time of the Embarcadero Center, this was kind of an arrangement that was made with the developers of the Embarcadero Center, with the redevelopment agency and the board of supervisors. And actually the developer team spent, by some accounts, nearly $5 million on public art, which was well over the kind of minimum 1% threshold. So this included 4 very large pieces of sculpture, like the one we see here. So there was one at each office tower building. There's also some sculpture inside the Hyatt Regency lobby. There's a number of other smaller sculptures kind of scattered throughout the Embarcadero Center. And originally, there were also some really amazing, very large scale textile works, some of which were like 3 stories tall. I wanted to stop and talk about this sculpture specifically. Other than the tulip, this is probably my favorite piece of public art that's still at the Embarcadero Center. This sculpture is called 2 Columns with Wedge, built in 1971 by a Swiss artist, Willy Gutmann. It's an 82-foot tall, 17-ton stainless steel sculpture. And an interesting fact is that it was fabricated by a San Francisco walk manufacturing company, Robert Yick and Co. So in the 1980s, as soon as the Embarcadero Center was completed, Portman announced that there was a plan for an expansion of the Embarcadero Center known as Embarcadero West. And that includes another hotel building that's just near here, as well as an extension of this pedestrian promenade and the renovation of the Federal Building, which is behind me. It's now the early 80s, and Portman has kind of started experimenting with a more postmodern architectural style, whereas the Embarcadero Center is very much in this kind of corporate modern, late modern design. This is a more kind of fun and whimsical kind of postmodern approach, playing off the classical architecture of the Federal Building. But the whole complex is still tied together with these concentric circle tile paving at the pedestrian level. This paving kind of gives a cohesive aesthetic throughout the entire Embarcadero Center. And here we're standing at kind of the very edge, leading out of Embarcadero Center and Embarcadero Center West. And I'll steal a little tidbit from John here. He likes to call this the choose your own adventure of architecture. As I mentioned before, Portman he had kind of a playful attitude towards movement through 3-dimensional space. And here you can see there's several different ways that you can leave this pedestrian plaza level and go down to the street. So there's this spiral staircase, or another set of stairs that leads to this dramatic kind of sloping stairway beneath the colonnades. You have different options for how to move through the space. And perhaps it's not the most efficient, but it is very fun and whimsical. All right, we're now in Transamerica Redwood Park. We're here at the foot of the Transamerica Pyramid, probably one of the most iconic buildings in San Francisco. It also was one of the most contentious buildings when it was proposed and constructed. And when this building was proposed, people were really concerned about how the building related to the adjacent neighborhoods and whether or not it was too tall for the city of San Francisco. The pyramid was approved slightly shorter than William Pereira, the architect's initial proposal. And also part of the conversation when Transamerica Pyramid was being proposed, Transamerica Corporation decided that they would utilize this extra space next to the Transamerica Pyramid to create a publicly accessible park area. And they kind of marketed this as giving back to the city of San Francisco. So rather than having it be strictly private space only for their office tenants, this was meant to be a publicly accessible space. The park was designed by landscape architect Anthony Gazzardo, and the park was completed in 1973. So it predates the 1985 downtown plan, which officially codified the privately owned public open space, or POPOS, program in San Francisco. But this park is really meant to feel like a park, much more vegetated and lush. You can see that this is a really good example of kind of like California modernist landscape design. The redwood trees and the fountain behind me are kind of meant to respond to the height and shape of the Transamerica Pyramid behind and bring some of that California nature into the park. And I think this is an interesting point of contrast to Embarcadero Center, which also has a lot of publicly accessible but privately owned space within the complex. But the approach is much more to create this kind of city within a city, sort of a street-like experience, but a more interior experience. So rather than storefronts along the street, you're kind of entering into the complex and moving through a retail environment that's sort of semi-outdoors, semi-private, semi-public. But these kind of examples of publicly accessible space in these large commercial developments really spoke to San Franciscans, and they really felt like they did deserve some kind of space or give backs from these commercial developments. And that was kind of what led to the inclusion of like a formal program for POPOs in the 1985 downtown plan. So now all large commercial developments within the downtown area of San Francisco are required to provide these POPOs, which can be sort of parks or plazas, somewhat like the one that we're standing in, or they can be rooftop gardens. There's a number of different kind of forms that POPOs take today. And there's many great examples throughout downtown that you should definitely check out.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for watching the virtual tour. We're now going to jump into a panel discussion, and we'll have our speakers now turn on their videos and their sound. And I think I'm going to punt over to my colleague here, Chris French, to ask the first question for our panel and also to have them introduce themselves.
Okay, I forgot to write down the first question, so I will definitely be punting that. But I wanted to thank you, Hannah and John, because that video was amazing. This is really a great new concept, I think, to show more interactive. And we had a very active chat while we were going on. So I do want to thank everybody for joining us today. I did post everyone's name inside the chat window. And if you're watching, if you want to use gallery view in your Zoom, if you click at the upper right-hand corner where it says view and click gallery, you will be able to see everybody who's on the panel. So I wanted to start with the introductions, have everyone introduce themselves alphabetically by first name, starting with Charles. Go ahead.
Greetings, Hannah. Also, kudos. That was just tremendous. Hats off. And the drone photography as well, whoever was responsible for that. I'm Charles Birnbaum, the founder, president, and CEO of the Cultural Landscape Foundation, and delighted to be here. Conversation about modernist landscapes. This to me is one of my favorite places to have that conversation. So thank you for the invitation. Chris.
Now we go to Daniel. Daniel, go ahead.
All right. Hi, I'm Daniel Paul. I'm a Southern California-based architectural historian, and I've done quite a lot of research on late modernism over the last nearly 20 years, including a tour in 2014 devoted just to office parks and these landscapes in Orange County from the 70s and 80s. So they're a very, very interesting subject. All right, I'm going to turn it over to John.
Another John. I'm John Rush. I'm a senior historic preservation specialist at ICF based in San Francisco. And with my firm, I've been involved in a number of investigations and evaluations of post-war public plazas and large-scale landscapes in San Francisco. So I think the next person alphabetically is Kelly.
Great, thanks, John. So I'm Kelly Wong. I'm a senior preservation planner at the San Francisco Planning Department and currently in the Zoning and Compliance Division. For the past couple of years, I've been working with our colleagues and interns on the POPOs program to clean up our inventory because it's actually, we have a lot, but a lot of people don't know about it. And we're also conducting a high-level evaluation of constructed POPOs, and then also how we might improve how we're managing and monitoring the constructed POPOs, and then how we might improve the designs of the new POPOs that are that will better serve the public. Thank you.
All right, Linda.
Hi, I'm Linda Day. I live in San Francisco. I'm a flaneur. I don't own a car, and I travel about the city on foot. I'm enchanted by downtown San Francisco, and I've researched and written about Lawrence Halperin's wonderful, wonderful work in downtown San Francisco.
Thank you so much, Linda. And thanks to our, I'm going to call her our co-producer, Gretchen. She's provided the question to me. So I'm going to start actually with Charles. If you could begin this discussion. How do large-scale infrastructure updates or changes, as in the Embarcadero Freeway, impact the historic integrity or the context of such sites like Embarcadero Plaza, Maritime Plaza, the Embarcadero Center, or even nationwide, if you can think of some other examples?
Sure. Well, that's great, Chris. Thank you. I think for me that the physical context will likely be tackled by a lot of my colleagues. I'd like to speak a bit to Halperin and the historical context for the work. The first is as a post-war, or in this case, a 70s piazza. Really that is, if you look across the country, the two major spaces that remain with some degree of integrity are in San Francisco and in Boston at Boston City Hall, which is undergoing a transformation right now by Sasaki. So I think at this juncture, this probably has the highest degree of integrity of any piazza in the post-war era. I think the other thing that's also very interesting about this, when you think about Halperin and having a 60-year career in the Bay Area, that this is really, along with UN Plaza, which is also facing a very uncertain future right now, these are the two projects from the first part of the 1970s. You think about Ghirardelli, which was mentioned earlier, which is a very traditional circular fountain as an object. But then in terms of fountains for choreography and animating life, this is really the first such effort, then followed by UN Plaza, ultimately Levi's, and leading up to the sort of capstone project with places like Letterman Lucas Studios. So it's important within his career canon and body of work. The last thing I want to say that I don't know a lot about, that I'm curious if any of my other colleagues do, is Armand Valancourt himself as an artist who is, I believe, still living in Santa Barbara, how this fits within his career canon as we look at managing change as well. Thanks.
Linda, did you want to follow up with that at all?
Yes, I do. And I appreciate that Mr. Birnbaum brings Valancourt to our attention. He is a radical activist. The Valancourt Fountain is a work of which he is very proud, and it still has resonance despite the dreadful freeway that was its backdrop being demolished. He is opposed to any efforts to change, or in fact, some who would like to see that fountain completely removed, because it speaks to a time and a place in a way that people come to see. People come to San Francisco, and that's on their list of the artworks they want to see. So when we look at UN Plaza, which, as Mr. Birnbaum suggests, is facing an uncertain future, what we see is not an issue with the fountain itself. It never really worked as Lawrence Halperin hoped that it would work, in terms of the water rising and falling to simulate the tides, but it is nevertheless a stunning work of sculpture, and the issues with it are not addressing its beauty, but rather the people who use the plaza. That is a very well used plaza. I walk through there several times a week. It is, we always say we want our public spaces activated. It is active, but it may be activated by persons that we don't all support the activities themselves. So I think that we have to separate a place from the people and just assume that if you demolish the fountain, the people will go away. They won't. There is a dearth of public space in the Tenderloin, and this really is a wonderfully active public space.
Thank you, Linda. We do have another question that relates to your response here, and it's about the role of public art. I know during the tour, Hannah pointed out several pieces of artwork that were part of that early effort to provide art to the public through development programs. And now San Francisco has the, I believe it's called the Arts for Architecture program, the 1% program. So I think my question for you is how, for the whole panel, is how public art fits into historic preservation efforts and how important these artworks are to the whole landscape, both Halperin's and the Sasaki landscape and Portman's work as well. So maybe I'll start with Kelly Wong here.
Well, I think it should be very important as part of a proposed project. I think that right now there isn't a lot of discussion between, the public art program and the actual landscape. There's a lot of leeway, I think, for what is being proposed. Are you talking about new construction work or just how the existing artwork fits in?
Yeah, I think there's as we all saw in the recording, there are some artworks that are almost like public fixtures or permanent fixtures of the landscape, like the Portman tulip, for example. And then there's artwork that could also be, structural and sort of a very important component of the integrity of the site, like the Valancourt fountain, which if you took out the fountain from the plaza, there's it certainly impacts the integrity. So I'm wondering how preservation and public art interact with each other with these large landscapes, and how, especially also how to manage these things, because with art, you typically take a conservation approach. With preservation, you can't always be taking a conservation approach. And these are outdoor installations which present their own challenges. So I know there's a lot rolled into that question, but maybe each of you can take a small component of each.
So maybe my response will be that when we're looking at evaluating, a site, let's just say an entire, site, we definitely do take into consideration, these components, including the artwork and how it fits into the entirety of the significance of that one site. So we would never, say that it would be okay to kind of pull it out without thinking about how it contributes to the, what it would be considered, I guess, the cultural landscape of that entirety of the site. So definitely it needs to be considered as part of its, integrity, and whether or not it rises to the level of, any alterations, I think is a different question, when you get to that point, but it definitely should be considered as part of it as a whole. Yeah.
I guess I also just want to chime in here. I think that as you look at Halperin's career, particularly in the Bay Area, that the blurring of lines between landscape architecture and public art is blurred. Angela Donaggio joins the firm in the mid-60s. She's trained as a sculptor and as a set designer. And I think that, places like the Portland chain of open spaces is a massive work of public art as much as it is a work of landscape architecture. And throughout Halperin's career, I think the goal, his quest, was to always work with artists. His last public open space system in Los Angeles, Halperin is the one that gets to identify all the opportunities where the artist's work will be cited. And so I think that, in Embarcadero as an early project, the plaza is more of a plinth than it is an art opportunity, whereas the artwork itself is a collaborative effort between Halperin and the artist. And so I think we should elevate landscape architecture in these important projects to the significant art form that it is, and not separate out the art, but think of it all comprehensively as the historic property in the way that the Secretary of the Interior does, and not look at buildings and art and landscape in isolation.
And I would like to build on that. As I think that at Embarcadero Plaza, the fountain actually provides this really interesting, I mean, Halperin is known for designing and implementing these fountains that invite, you know, exploration, circulation of the users of the plaza. So as we saw with Tony Hawk, he definitely got in there. But you can also, you know, people have described that fountain as an urban grotto that you can go and explore yourself. And definitely the same thing is true at UN Plaza. So there's a kind of way that it acts as a stage for continued use and human activity that is so central to those landscapes. As kind of a quick counterexample, we saw Maritime Plaza from across the way in the tour, and that's a very different. That's more of a traditional modernist landscape, but that's more broken into these various courts that have public art at the center. So there, it's less about direct interaction or exploring, and more about sort of, I guess you could say, contemplation. But public art in that space too just plays an extremely important role.
And
Thanks,
to
go
build
ahead,
further. Sorry, did I
Go
cut you off, Chris?
Nope, go ahead.
I was just gonna piggyback further onto what John Rush was saying, and point out that I think the Embarcadero Center is sort of an interesting hybrid of approaches between those approaches to public art, because there are these pieces of public art. I mean, the tulip is designed by Portman, but the other pieces of public art are designed by sculptors and textile artists and muralists, and they're more like placed in the Embarcadero Center, but they have this kind of scale that does invite some more of this kind of exploration around and through them that is more similar to the fountain. So the sculptures at the center of each of the office tower complexes extend up through, you know, 3 stories of retail environment. And previously there were these large textile works that also extended through multiple stories of those kind of retail podiums. So you could experience and see these works at kind of different levels and from different angles, that invites kind of a different kind of exploration within that space. And unfortunately, some of those pieces have been lost over time, but the main sculptures are still there.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I wanted to throw this to Daniel. You have a very unique experience and viewpoint, especially with the skyscrapers, I think. And so is there anything you'd like to add to this conversation so far?
Sure, thank you. Just a couple of things, and I believe that they're connected. I think some of the issues with trying to save, you know, when John brought up public art, some of the same issues are commiserate with the issues we have with preserving late modern architecture, and it's that taste goes in cycles. A lot of developers think that the new thing is always the better thing. And you have to raise this awareness to people before it's too late. As you know, Charles, we lost a Lawrence Halperin. We lost Wells Fargo Court, which was by Lawrence Halperin, 1983 on Bunker Hill. You may know better than I do about why specifically they wanted to get rid of that. But I do see a lot down here. Nestle USA headquarters in Glendale from 1986 just got ripped out. So often it seems that there's this perception with those who make the decisions in this, or the property owners, that something is old or something is worn out or needs to be quote unquote modernized. It's really ironic when people need to modernize late modernism, you know. Just quickly related to this, there's a Sasaki Walker landscape, which was wonderful in Orange County for Fleur, which was a large Welton Beckett Associates mirrored glass, 1.3 million square foot complex, gorgeous landscape around it. It's being completely built in because of development pressure. So there was an understanding in Irvine that the building might be something special, but the landscape around it is gone. And then finally, related to this on public art and just dealing with this area is the Triforium here in Southern California. A public art piece that's been very polarizing for a long time. It's associated with an amazing mall that's subterranean that anybody in LA should go see quickly before it's all wiped out, with all kinds of public art and sculpture in that landscape. But yet, so many of these things, they feel like they're on the verge. I mean, we here, but hopefully others in the larger population, if these landscapes can survive perhaps another 5 years, 10 years, maybe the taste cycle will return and it'll be easier to preserve some of these resources. So those are the concerns I see down here.
Thank you, Daniel. Excellent points. Linda, I have a question for you. I don't know if you wanted to make a point. I see you raising your hand.
I did. I wanted to respond to this discussion in that when Valancourt created the fountain, he intended it to be immersive for people to walk through, to enjoy the spray. And with our litigious society, that's probably not possible. So it seems to me we can preserve the sculptural quality without having it be immersive. And at the UN Plaza, the Halperin fountain is stunning sculpture. I don't think it needs the water. Willett Moss, who's a landscape architect here in San Francisco, has proposed an alteration that would not have it be a fountain, but rather a landscape using those wonderful Sierra Nevada granite boulders with grass, so that people could immerse themselves in that sculpture without it involving the water that never worked anyway and is very hard to keep clean and maintain.
Great points, Linda.
Sorry, John, I'm sorry. I'd like to respond to that, please. I want to respectfully disagree with just about everything that was just stated, that Halperin was passionate about the choreography of people and water, that they were musical, and that, 2 years before UN opened, we had the opening of Lovejoy in Portland. And the mayor pulled Mr. Halperin aside at the opening event and said, Larry, we've got a problem here. People want to go in this fountain and we just cannot have that. And Larry said, yes, Mr. Mayor, I understand. And then he jumped in and invited everyone to join him. And so I don't think the fountain is the fountain without the water as an animating quality. It is a static collection of stones with inscribed statements, very much in the same way that if you had a well-articulated garden design and you turned it over to be a bed of pachysandra, it loses its character-defining qualities, and in this case, the use, which is central to an evaluation of a project work for a National Register eligible work of landscape architecture. So although I agree with the fact that Willett Moss is an incredibly talented landscape architect, and I have great appreciation for the Beaux-Arts elements of that design that are being respected as part of its bone structure, I think is a significant fountain by Halperin. It is no longer a fountain when it is a performative wetland in a collection of stones.
Thank you, Charles. Both excellent points, and we love disagreement here. It's always nice to hear dissenting opinions, I should say. So I wanted to ask, sort of take a complete 180 here and ask about housing, not just housing, but also the things that the pandemic has sort of wrought upon us. And Margot had a question. She was talking about how office space, the use of office space is changing, how people, and Embarcadero Center itself is, I don't know how much percent, but it's probably 90% office use. I don't know. But anyways, I wanted to ask our panelists what you think the use of these downtown urban landscapes will be in an era where office spaces no longer comes at a premium and people are more likely to need things like housing or other types of uses for these buildings. Do you think it's appropriate to change the use with the Embarcadero Center?
I'm going to pick Hannah for this one.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think that you could tell from the video tour that Embarcadero, the kind of feeling of Embarcadero Center has changed a lot during the pandemic. I mean, we were there on a Friday, which normally would be bustling with office workers and other people around the financial district, you know, coming to get coffee or lunch or do some shopping in between working. But that obviously was not happening hardly at all while we were there. And I think that's kind of how it's been during the pandemic. So I think that it's a great question. I think it remains to be seen. I think that there definitely are cases in which office buildings could be converted to housing, and there could be a shift in what the kind of nature of use is in the downtown area. I mean, just immediately adjacent the Embarcadero Center, the Golden Gateway Center, I think it's called, or maybe it has a different name now, but part of the overall Golden Gateway redevelopment project was a series of condos and apartments. And so, you know, there are residential uses right next to there. So I don't think it's incompatible, and perhaps the exact retail environment may change. But I think that if anything, the pandemic has shown us how important open space is in the city. And even if the kind of retail environment of the Embarcadero Center hasn't been as lively, people are definitely still out using the open spaces. Perhaps, you know, the downtown ones, not as much as some of our other parks throughout the city, but I think that there's still great value in those spaces. And I have no doubt that their use will continue to evolve over time, even as the kind of architectural and landscape architectural kind of design and intent is preserved. I think those uses can change.
Just wanted to piggyback on that and just say that from the planning department's perspective, the planning code section that requires the POPOS requirement, there has been a recent update to include Central Soma special use district developments, and there's been much more emphasis on programming and trying to look at who the users are, and not to be just office, workers, in the downtown sort of like corridor, but looking at families, diversity of, ages, anywhere from seniors to like children. And so what we're trying to do is actually approach it so that these public spaces can be used by a variety of people, and not just, and including residents and not just office workers. So there definitely is a focus on shifting that so that it can be much more open and community oriented. So thanks.
Kelly, that's such a good segue to a question I wanted to ask, because, the POPOS program was started as a way to give a public benefit back from these big development projects happening downtown. And I think the way they've turned out, and what you guys have discovered at the planning department, is that a lot of them actually people don't know about, or they have barriers to access that make it hard for members of the public to find and use them. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious what the panelists, first what Kelly thinks, and then also what the rest of you think. If these programs are meant to create privately created public spaces, what does that mean for the public user who wants to use them, and sort of what kind of difficulties might that cause?
So I will share and admit that, our greatest, or one of our sort of greatest complaints that we receive for POPOS is access, and like trying to get into some of these privately owned spaces, because typically there are security guards, et cetera. And sometimes they require you to show ID for, sake of like security or some sort of, just to make sure that they know who's coming in or out of the buildings. And this is for a lot of these POPOs that are typically on like the rooftops or interior spaces. And the emphasis right now going forward is trying to create more open space outdoors. There actually is a cap within the planning code that says that no greater than 20% cumulative can be indoors. And so that is something that we have to be aware of. And so, trying to be more like, how New York does it, where they don't have any interior POPOs, but they actually just make it completely exterior so that people can come in and out as they please. And so what was the second part of your question, and whether or not that?
I'm just curious what you all think, like, what does that mean when we talk about preservation then too? Because if, it's already hard to access, and then they're also privately controlled, what does that mean in terms of preservation?
Well, I see two separate issues here going on. So there's the preservation issue, and then there's the potential for these for the future, if there is more, if to go back to the office as housing issue, that's when a lot of these spaces may truly come into their own. I mean, certainly Embarcadero Center is used by the public in general quite often now, but a lot of these other ones may meet their full potential if some urban office became housing and not just used by people in the office eating lunch. And I can only imagine them having a wonderful potential for that in the future, outdoor Wi-Fi, whatever the case is, if they are not all wiped out, if there's if there is a change from office to housing, presumably there would be a regulatory change or some sort of liability concern. I would hope that would not mean that there's some new code wherein a lot of these get lost because, we got to make this housing now. We can't have this artwork here anymore. It has to be, whatever, childproof or whatever the case is. In terms of preservation, which of course is related to that, I was actually talking with John a little bit earlier before this panel began. And it's a really interesting situation if they are privately owned. Certainly, how do we document these? Even in California here on a DPR form, you would probably need owner support to landmark it. And these, when we were talking about public art earlier, in these, of course, the public art is not in a vacuum from the rest of the piece. It's all of one site with objects in it. But there is a Halperin open space sequence on the National Register in Portland. I mean, so there is a precedent for preserving these. But I'm personally very curious to see how these go if and when office becomes housing more often in the future.
Thanks, Daniel. I was going to ask some more questions, but we have reached the end of our hour, so we'll have to save it for next time. But Charles, I have a question for you. We are going to be hosting Charles and the Cultural Landscape Foundation next Tuesday for another webinar about landscapes. Charles, you want to just give us a hint about what you'll be revealing?
Sure. Well, it's going to be dedicated to post-war plazas. I'm very excited that Nate Cormier, who oversees the landscape architecture division of Rios's office, will be presenting with me. A couple of case studies from the Los Angeles area. And we hope that you'll tune in, but we're going to try to put some metrics out there. So in terms of John's question, looking at how do we balance integrity and significance with the kinds of changes that we're all talking about today. So thanks.
Excellent. I can't wait. So, and thank you again, Charles, and the Cultural Landscape Foundation for being our partner in this series of 1970s post-war, recent past, as John likes to say. And also thank you to US Modernist Radio for being our series sponsor. And of course, a big thank you to all of you for really, we really appreciate it for you dedicating your time and all of your expertise to our conversation today. I just wanted to remind everybody that registration for our conference is open now, and you can find that on our website, californiapreservation.org. John and I are planning some really exciting stuff for the conference, right, John?
Yes. Oh, I didn't know whether I was muted or yeah, we're looking forward to the conference June 8th through 10th this year. So we encourage you, registration is open on the site. And I just pasted into the chat box both a feedback form for everybody to let us know how we did today, but also the link to the virtual tour. You can watch it in 4K resolution if you want to go back and watch it later on YouTube. It was only in
I'm watching it again. I'm doing it again. That was a good tour.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hannah, for your time. Also, thank you, Gretchen, for being our able moderator of questions today. There were a lot that came in, and we weren't able to address them all, but we are happy to take some by email. If you just send those to us, we'll forward them to the correct panelist here so that they can answer it by email. So anything you want to close out with, Chris?
I just want to ask everybody to come back next Tuesday at noon. It will be free, and we want to thank our sponsors for helping us keep all of our programs free for the public. And if you'd like to donate as well, you can go to our website. So we'll see everyone next week. And